All right, everyone. If you really want to understand the wild world of NIL that we live in today, you have to go back to the very beginning. And honestly, one of the most ambitious early blueprints came out of Georgia with House Bill 617. It was this bold, really fascinating attempt to write the rules from scratch. So in this breakdown, we're going to get into its most innovative and, yeah, its most controversial ideas. Let's do it.
So right out of the gate, the bill makes this incredibly powerful statement. For decades, the whole system was built on the idea that being a student athlete meant you had to give up the right to profit from your own name, your own identity. Well, this sentence right here is the official legal rejection of that entire concept. It frames NIL not as some special privilege, but as a fundamental right that was being taken away. You got to understand everything else in this law flows from this one powerful idea.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the basics, the green light for NIL in Georgia. Then we'll get into the specifics, the playbooks for both the athletes and for the universities. After that, we dive into the really interesting fine print, contracts, and this kind of wild idea they had called pooling. And then we'll wrap it all up by looking at the law's built-in self-destruct button, which tells you a whole lot about Georgia's strategy.
All right, Section 1, the green light. Before we can get into all the rules and regulations, we first have to understand who and what this law is even talking about. Because, in any piece of legislation, the definitions, they shape the entire game.
So, who's covered by this? Well, the law defines a student athlete super broadly. It's not just your star quarterback or your starting point guard. No, it's anyone who participates in or is even just eligible to participate in a college sport. Now, that's a key detail, right? It makes sure that all these rights and protections apply to literally everyone on the roster, from the Heisman favorite all the way down to the walk-on.
This right here, this is the fundamental battleground of the entire NIL debate. The law tries to draw this really bright line in the sand. Paying an athlete for their marketing value, that's totally okay. But paying them just to get them to come to your school, what the law calls an inducement, that is a big no-no. This whole distinction between legitimate marketing and what people call pay for play was the central challenge for lawmakers. And honestly, it's a line that's still pretty blurry even today.
A huge fear for athletes at the time was, hey, if I start earning money, am I going to lose my scholarship? This law tackled that concern head on. It makes it crystal clear that a scholarship is not compensation for NIL, and a school absolutely cannot pull that scholarship just because an athlete signs a deal with, say, a local pizza place. This was a critical protection.
Okay, so the law sets up the basic right to earn money. But what does that actually look like for the athlete on the ground? Well, that brings us right to Section 2, the athlete's playbook. This section lays out their brand new rights and, just as importantly, their brand new responsibilities. So with this new freedom came some new chores, basically. Athletes were now required to disclose every single contract to their university. That created a whole new layer of compliance they had to worry about. But the law wasn't just about rules. It was also about education. It mandated 5 hours of financial literacy and life skills training, which was a clear signal that lawmakers wanted to actually equip these athletes to manage their new money responsibly. And this was a massive shift. For decades, even talking to an agent could get your eligibility stripped in a heartbeat. This law flips that completely and explicitly gives student athletes the right to hire professional help. Agents, lawyers, you name it. This was all about empowering athletes to navigate this complex new world with an expert in their corner.
Okay, so we have the athlete's playbook. Now let's flip it and look at the university side of things. The law wasn't just about empowering athletes. It was also about setting up some really clear guardrails for the institutions themselves.
The theme here is actually pretty simple. Get out of the way. Universities and associations like the NCAA were explicitly forbidden from punishing an athlete just for earning NIL money. They couldn't penalize a whole school either. And notice that third point. The university itself can't be the one paying the athlete. This just reinforces that line between legitimate NIL and pay for play.
And this is the other side of that education coin we were talking about. The responsibility wasn't just on the athlete to show up to the workshop. The university was now legally required to provide it. The law made this totally non-negotiable. It ensured that every school had to invest in its athletes' financial and personal development, not just their performance on the field.
All right, now we get to the really unique stuff. And for you, as sport law and management students, this is probably the most interesting part of the entire bill. This is the fine print, the stuff that covers contract disputes, and this truly novel idea called a pooling arrangement.
So let's just start right there. This was easily one of the most talked about and honestly one of the most debated provisions in any state-level NIL bill at the time. What exactly was Georgia proposing with this idea of a pooling arrangement?
This is the number that made everybody's head spin, 75%. The law allowed a university to put a clause in a team contract that required an athlete to contribute up to 75% of their NIL earnings into a shared pool. I mean, that is a staggering figure. So let's break down how this was supposed to work.
So how would this actually function? An athlete makes their contribution, the university holds onto the money in a protected account, and then after they've left the school, they get a proportional payout. Now, think about the goal here. It's basically a form of wealth redistribution designed to make sure that the offensive linemen or the athletes in non-revenue sports could benefit from the quarterback's huge endorsement deal. It's a pretty radical concept, really, all aimed at team-wide equity. The law also set up this very clear, step-by-step process for what happens when an athlete's personal deal might conflict with a team's sponsorship. It's a three-step dance. The athlete has to disclose the deal. The university can then say, hey, we have a conflict, but, and this is the critical legal point, the school has to identify these specific clauses in the contract that are in violation. They couldn't just reject a deal because they didn't like it. They had to give a real contractual reason. That gave athletes a solid legal footing for any disputes.
All right, on to our final section. What made Georgia's HB 617 so strategic, so clever, was that it was never meant to be a permanent fix. It was a law built on a clock, with a built-in expiration date known as a sunset clause. And here are the 3 triggers that would basically make the whole law vanish into thin air. First, if a federal NIL law was passed, that would obviously take over. Second, if an athletic association, and let's be real, they mean the NCAA, adopted its own rules allowing compensation, well, then the state law wouldn't be needed anymore. And if neither of those 2 things happened, there was a hard stop, June 30th, 2025.
So when you put all that together, the sunset clause reveals the bill's true genius. This wasn't just a law, it was a strategic power move. By putting an expiration date on it, Georgia was forcing the hand of the NCAA and the U.S. Congress. They were essentially saying, look, we'll create our own system, but only until you guys get your act together and create a national one. It was just a masterclass in legislative pressure.
And that brings us to our final thought here. We know this law was temporary by design, right? It was a placeholder until a national solution came along. But as you continue your studies in sport law and management, I want you to think about how its specific, really innovative ideas, like that controversial pooling arrangement or the mandatory financial literacy workshops, how they continue to echo. How did these early state-level experiments still shape the debates that we're having about the future of college athletics right now?